As we get started this morning, the question I'd like to ask, and again, don't answer out loud. But if you consider your kind of journey of faith, like whatever that means for you, like where are you on that journey? You know that it's something that we all start, right? I mean, some of us though may not remember the start. I mean, I know folks who kind of never really remember not believing in Jesus. That just kind of going back as young as they can remember, they had that experience. But even if that's the case, it's still a bit of a journey, right? That you still have a relationship. And so kind of where are you in that relationship with God? You know, maybe you're at a point in your life where you're kind of starting that relationship, or maybe you're restarting that relationship. Do you think maybe you've arrived, you've got it all figured out, and you're good to go? If so, see me after class, by the way. Right? Because it is a journey. And sometimes, and this is kind of one of the biggest challenges, sometimes we can remember being further along than we are right now. That there was a time where believing seemed easier, where following seemed easier. And sometimes, because of what happens in life, that gets harder to hold on to. So as I talked about beforehand, we're kicking off a new series today that I've called New Beginnings. And what I want to talk about throughout this series is our journey of faith. You know, how it evolves. You know, like all journeys, our journeys of faith have a start. They have a beginning. There's some version of a first step. But part of what makes that journey, so special, makes it kind of exciting if we think about it, is that it's personal, right? No two of us have the exact same faith journey. There are things that we have in common with one another, but no two peoples are the same. And a faith journey, if we actually engage with it, is a period of growth. It's a period of change. And if we really engage with it, and if we really try to follow Jesus, whatever that means for you and how you interpret that and what you believe he's calling you to do, or how you may struggle with it. Is there such a thing as Jesus really calling me? Or is this just something that we've all made up? Right? We all have those sort of experiences. But if we engage with it honestly, it's something that has many beginnings. That as you travel on the journey, you have new undertakings, you have new experiences. Those experiences will often lead you into new directions. But the thing that's most important, and I think this is the central part of really engaging with our faith journey, is embracing the fact that it is a lifelong experience, which means it takes time. And the thing is that as we travel that long journey, it's often not all good. In fact, I don't know anyone whose whole journey has been good. It has challenges. There are times where we have incredible doubts, where we face incredible uncertainty. And if God was really here, he wouldn't let this happen. Because it feels like there's no way that this would make any sense. And one thing I want to say is that if you've had those experiences, and I think many of us have, that it's normal. Right? That journey it's normal. Right? Some people believe completely. And their whole lives, they may have ups and downs, but they always believe. There are people who struggle to ever believe. There are lots of things in between that. There are lots of people who say that, I believe Jesus is real, and I'll buy that Savior thing, but, I come to church once a month. Maybe once a quarter. Maybe Christmas. I mean, I believe in all, but do I really need to do that? Do I really need to do those sort of things? Do I really need to put Jesus first in my life? Do I really need to follow his leading? Can't I just leave my own life and just believe? And can't we just keep these two things separate? Sure. There are other people who just say, again, as I mentioned earlier, I just can't believe. I mean, for much of my life, I just absolutely could not believe. I could not reconcile the world I saw with what I had been taught as a child, as a Christian. I couldn't put those two things together. Honestly, I still can't. Not what I was taught as a child. What I've come to understand about Jesus and recognizing that it's about Jesus and what Jesus leads us to do, not what people tell us we should do, not what people tell us we should believe, but what we find when we see the words of Jesus and where he guides us. And all those experiences are normal. But one of the big problems that I had as a child, and I don't believe this is uniquely me, that when I would hear the narratives of the New Testament, particularly the Gospels, and I would hear the narratives of these first Jesus followers, his apostles, and his other early followers, I would hear their stories and I would simply say, I can't believe all that. Because what I would always hear over and over again was that they would describe someone's faith journey as they saw Jesus, they believed Jesus, they worshiped Jesus, they followed Jesus. Boom, done. And it all happened in an instant. And I said, I can't identify with that. I can't identify with this concept of just encountering Jesus, fully surrendering and giving up my life and just believing all that. I couldn't engage with that. And one of the narratives that was a bit challenging for me is the narrative of the apostle Nathanael meeting Jesus. Now, Nathanael's kind of interesting because you don't really hear a whole bunch about Nathanael in the Gospels, but this is what Nathanael went through as he met Jesus. So when we first encounter Nathanael, he's kind of hanging out under a tree somewhere. And as he's sitting there, his friend Philip walks up to him. Now, Philip had just recently become a Jesus follower. And Philip goes up to Nathanael and says, Hey, Nathanael, I think I found the Messiah, that guy we've been looking for. I think it's this Jesus of Nazareth guy. And what Nathanael says in response, where's he from? Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth? His first reaction is an insult because of where Jesus comes from. And Philip's actually excellent in this point. Philip doesn't argue with him. Philip doesn't turn his back on him. He says, hey, just come check it out yourself. Just come meet him. You make your own decision. But because Philip and Nathanael had a relationship, Nathanael trusted Philip and decided to give Jesus a chance. And so he walks up to see Jesus. He follows Philip. And as they get to where Jesus is, much to Nathanael's surprise, Jesus kind of greets him. Jesus says, oh, it's Nathanael. He's a good and honest man. Now here's the thing. Nathanael had never met Jesus. Nathanael didn't consider himself a person that would have had such a great reputation that everyone around town knew about him. So as Jesus says that to him, Nathanael says, how do you know me? And Jesus responds this way. I could see you under the fig tree before Philip found you. Now the thing is that we don't actually know what was going on under the fig tree. We don't know if Nathanael was praying. We don't know if he was actually dealing with some kind of crisis. We don't know if he was kind of struggling with his faith. We don't know what was going on there. What we do know is those words from Jesus had a profound impact on Nathanael. And so as Jesus says that to Nathanael, Nathanael exclaimed, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. That in the matter of something less than an hour, Nathanael goes from being disparaging towards Jesus, not believing in Jesus, to, you're the Son of God. You're the promised King. And I'm like, I can't do that. That's not what it was like for me, and it's not what it's like for a lot of people that I know. And so I took those kinds of experiences and I started to overlay them over the other apostles, because if that's what the apostle journey was like, I can't follow it. But the thing is that Nathanael's is kind of more of an outlier. Most of the apostles had very, very different experiences. Most of them did not buy in completely. Most of them had a process of some kind. Right? In fact, we know that, for example, like for James and Andrew. James and Andrew had actually been kind of diligently seeking the Messiah. They had actually been kind of studying. They were actually followers of John the Baptist. Right? So, as followers of John the Baptist was preaching about the coming Messiah. So they were studying for him. They were looking for him. They were hoping for him. We might say they were religious, and they had been going to Sunday school or going to church. And the way they meet Jesus is that one day they're talking to John the Baptist, and Jesus walks by. And John the Baptist says, hey, that's the guy I've been telling you about. Basically saying, I'm giving you permission. Don't follow me anymore. Follow him. So they had kind of studied, and they followed that way. And I think that seems like, okay, well, if you're religious, there's a path. But it turns out that some of the guys, as far as we can tell, were not particularly religious. Right? For example, Peter and Andrew. Right? Peter and Andrew, basically, as far as we can tell, Peter and James. Peter and the Apostle James. Kind of one aside, by the way. The Apostle James is not the James we were talking about a few weeks ago. So the Apostle James and Peter did not seem particularly religious. So how did they come to follow Jesus? Because their brothers believed first. That James was John's brother, John who'd been following John the Baptist. Andrew was Peter's brother, and Andrew had been following John the Baptist. So they built their relationship with Jesus first to their relationship with their brothers. And in fact, James, John, Andrew, and Peter actually all worked together. They had a fishing business together. So it was all anchored in this relationship with one another first. And then through that, they followed Jesus. You know, and each of those sort of things, right, each of those are parts of the journey. Right, so as we go through our journeys of faith, what I want to encourage us to do is actually be open to what God is doing in your life, what he's personally leading you through. I know some of you, I think many of you are lifelong Christians. Some of you have come to faith later. Some of us have gone to church but maybe didn't really believe that much or believed a little bit but started to believe more. Some of us had to experience a crisis to turn to God. You know, in my case it was, I was raised with one thing. I couldn't believe it. Went away for a few decades. And then just kind of one person said something to me that kind of resonated in a way that other things hadn't. You know, and I dealt with some challenges of my own making that I had to get through. And God moved in those things. And through those experiences, God led me back to him. But whatever your journey is, those things are all normal parts of the journey. From lifelong faith to doubt to having trouble believing to trying to figure out what to do. All of those things are part of the journey. They're part of the journey in our lives. And honestly, if we read the Gospels closely, we see that those were the journeys of the original apostles as well. Some, like Nathaniel, believed right away, had just a quick change of heart. Others studied throughout their lives, like Andrew and John. Others got there because of family members or friends. In fact, the one thing that seems to be consistent as we look at the apostles' journey to know Jesus was it involves relationships over and over again, that this willingness to engage with other people about their faith. Right? For Nathaniel, he had that incredible moment because his friend Philip shared what he had experienced with him. Right? Peter and John, I keep doing that. Peter and James, because of their brothers. Right? All those relationships. In fact, my kind of favorite I met Jesus and I shared it with my friend story is Matthew. When Jesus calls Matthew, the first thing he does was throw a party, or a banquet, a dinner, lots of food. Matthew was pretty wealthy, we think. So he throws this big party, and what he does is he brings all of his relationships together. He's got his new friend, Jesus, so he invites Jesus over. And then he invites his old friends, the other tax collectors, the other outsiders, people that did not seem good enough for the other religious people. He invites them in. But then he also invites his new Christian friends in, and he brings them all together. That he saw a key part of his relationship with Jesus, this newfound relationship of being in relationship with other people and connecting with that. And so as they went through that relationship, they all grew. In fact, they all grew together. And I think the thing I would want us to kind of keep in mind as we think about our journeys of faith is the aspect of taking our time. I mean, if you're like me, I just want everything done like now, sort of thing. But our faith journeys generally don't work that way. Even if you start to believe quickly, there's still so much that we can encounter. In fact, I believe that if we could go back in time and we could actually meet up with those very first apostles and we could ask them questions and said, hey, when did you believe? When did you really believe in Jesus? Like, when did you know that he was the Son of God? I don't think they would directly answer our question. I think they would tell us to slow down, that it takes time, that it's supposed to take time. It's supposed to be a journey. What they would tell us is that for most of them, what started out as interest, they saw something in Jesus that grabbed their attention, that made them at least believe in him as someone who had something to say. As they spent more time around him, and they spent more time with others who were pursuing him, they started to see things happen. They might see Jesus do some things, but they also saw Jesus do things in their lives. And the more they saw, the more they started to understand. And then the more they understood, the more they could believe. I think that their key advice to us in our faith journeys would be to keep an open mind, right? And to not be overly focused on our expectations of what God is doing. In fact, don't be overly focused on our expectations of how God's going to do what he does. Because I think what they would tell us, in fact, what I'll tell you from my life, is that when I think God's going to do something a certain way or he's going to do a certain thing, I miss what he's actually doing. Right? That I can walk through my life hoping that God will show up where I'm trying to go. And maybe the answer is, I need to look for where he's already at and head in that direction. As opposed to me yelling back to Jesus, come on, keep up. Right? It's more like settle down and look around and see what he's up to. The thing is that because there is no one way to faith, we can't be discouraged when we see people's journeys who are different than ours. Right? We need to be open to what God is up to and what he's doing in our lives individually. And as I describe all these things that the apostles were doing, that as they started sharing this with one another, and they started sharing it with other people, and Matthew's throwing parties and bringing people together, we might be tempted to think that, they're all in. They must, at this point, if they're telling other people about what they're experiencing, they must really believe he's the Son of God at this point. But the Apostle John actually tells us that's not the case. What we see is this concept of they belonged with Jesus before they believed with Jesus. In other words, they trusted that he had something to say. They trusted that there was something going on in their lives that was better than what they had before, that there was a path that they could experience. They weren't necessarily sure he was the Son of God. I think some didn't even really think in those terms much. But they had this opportunity to belong together before they fully believed. So how do we know? What does John tell us that gives us this indication that the other apostles didn't believe until later? Well, John actually tells us straight away. John says that there is one particular event that occurs, which is when most of them started to believe. It's known as the wedding at Cana. It's one of Jesus' most famous miracles. It's when he turns the water into wine. Right? Because what John actually says to us when he describes this water in the wine situation, he says, this miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. In other words, that was the moment for most of them. When they see him turn water into wine, they go, he's not just a special rabbi. He's not just a special teacher. They started to believe that he was something more. And I think if we could go back and talk to John as he's there and as he's writing this stuff down and he tells us what he's experienced, he would tell us that we need to understand where the other apostles were. First of all, they were all very young men. We think most of them were teenagers. Peter was probably in his 20s, but the others were probably teenagers. And so they were still growing as individuals, but also they were still growing in their faith. And those apostles had a lot of growing to do. They needed time. And one of the things that I would encourage us to remember, the Gospels that we read were not written in real time. right? There weren't people walking around taking notes. Like, like an executive has an executive assistant who's writing things down for him all the time when they're walking around. That wasn't what was going on. When were the Gospels actually written down? Do you know? Years later. Even Matthew's is probably, I'm trying to think, 15, 20 years later. John's is decades later. So what does that mean? If it wasn't written down in real time, we're not capturing necessarily what they thought at the time. When we look at the Gospels, what we're actually getting to get a piece of is their reflections and experience as they look back on what was happening after everything else that they'd seen. They write this stuff down after they have seen Jesus die and be resurrected, after they have spent their lives sharing the message of Jesus with other people, that they're looking back on it, that they develop clarity over time. And that's the thing for us, is that we are so tempted to look at every experience in the isolation. This is what happened to me, this must be what it means. This is what happened to me, this must be what it means. And what they discover, and what John really captures for us really, really well, was that they didn't understand at the time. That they started to understand later. Because as John actually saw that this miracle of turning the water into wine, initially he thinks it's a miracle. But later, after having experiences in his life, and after he sees everything Jesus has done, he realizes something more than a miracle. What he actually says is, it is a miraculous sign. After he'd seen the resurrected Jesus, after he'd had all those experiences with Jesus, what Jesus did was a sign that Jesus was the Son of God, that Jesus was the promised King, the new Messiah. He could only realize that later after he'd seen everything he experienced. And if we think about this idea of what happened on that day of the wedding, like, why was it a sign? Like, why is turning water into wine a sign? I mean, it's a money saver, sort of thing? Right? There's more going on than that. In fact, it's only been recently that I've begun to understand why it was such an important sign. Now, many of you have probably heard this narrative, but I'm going to just kind of walk through it anyway. So the narrative of the wedding at Cana, or the water in the wine event, basically is this big wedding that's going on. Jesus, the other apostles are invited there. It appears that Jesus' mother Mary is somehow helping out with the wedding. And remember that weddings in that time, it wasn't like a 3 or 4 hour affair. Weddings at that time went on for days. And so when you were throwing a large wedding with a lot of people, as this family was, making sure you had plenty of supplies was really important, because running out of key supplies would have been hugely embarrassing. And they realized that they're running out of wine, and Mary sees that that's about to happen. And so Mary goes to Jesus, and he tells him, and he basically says, hey, can you help these guys out? And when he does that, or when she does that, Jesus does this next. So she asks Jesus to help out. John tells us that standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus told the servants, fill the jars with water. Now, what about that makes it a sign? Well, those jars were part of their religious practices. In fact, they were a central part of their religious practice. In the first century Judaism, a key part of relationship with God was this concept of being ceremonially clean. In other words, it's this ritual you have to go through to be considered clean before God. And if you go through that ritual, then there are certain religious things you're allowed to do. Well, the water in those jars, and those jars themselves, were part of that practice. So they were part of the Old Covenant. In other words, the Old Testament relationship between God and his people. In fact, modern theologians tell us that those jars were a central part of the old covenant, that they were really a symbol of the old covenant, and they were filled with water, and that water was part of that old covenant. When Jesus turns the water into wine, and he tells the servants to take a taste of the wine to the man in charge tastes the wine, and what happens? He turns to the groom and he says, this is the man in charge. A host always serves the best wine first. Then when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine. But you have kept the best until now. This was a sign that Jesus was ushering in something brand new. Because the best was coming later, was coming afterwards. And the water was part of the old covenant. And now he's taken that water from the old covenant, and the symbol of the old covenant, turned it into wine, and someone describes it as the best comes later. Now, as John and his other apostles are watching this wouldn't have meant a great deal to them. It's like, oh, cool, it's great wine. But again, remembering when John wrote all this down, what other experiences had he had by then? He had seen Jesus die and be resurrected, but he also had a really special experience with Jesus the night before Jesus died. What we call the Last Supper, right? The thing that we celebrate today after church. And what's the key thing that we use in our communion, but in the Last Supper? After the bread, we have what? Wine. Well, when Jesus was sitting with them at the Last Supper, on that final night before he is crucified, it's described this way. After supper, Jesus took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." What John now realized and understood, that as Jesus showed up at that wedding, and as he turned the water in the wine, when he took the water that was in the symbol of the old covenant, those jars, and he turned it into the symbol of the new covenant, the wine, Jesus says, I'm ushering in something brand new. This isn't an evolution of the old relationship. This is a new beginning, a new relationship between God and his people. Jesus is saying that I am that new relationship. It's through me you establish that new relationship. I am changing the symbols now. And the kingdom of God has arrived. The kingdom of God is not something far away that we experience when we die. The kingdom of God is something that Jesus invites us into right now, to live a life where we do put Jesus first in our lives, first in our hearts, where we live out our relationship with Jesus by actually doing the things that Jesus calls us to do, to share him with other people, but also to represent him to other people, to show up, to volunteer, to support people, to use our resources to help people who don't have resources. That's the new beginning that Jesus brought in, where we have a relationship with God through faith, but we live it out as Jesus describes it. If we live it out the way Jesus demonstrates it, that Jesus did come to show us what God was like, but he also came to give us a path to connect with God and show us how we are to live our lives. That's the new covenant. And this is when John looks at all that and he says, that moment was the sign that Jesus was the Son of God, that Jesus is the new Messiah. And again, if we could actually sit down and talk to John, he would say, as big as that was, we literally saw Jesus announce himself. We didn't understand that at the time. We needed time to understand that. We needed to have those other experiences to realize why that experience was important. And the thing that I want to encourage us with is that's your journey and my journey too, right? Whether you've lived as a follower of Jesus your whole life, whether you're someone who's just exploring it, you're just uncertain. Maybe you think Jesus is a really good model for life, but Son of God, I don't know. Stay engaged. I mean, the apostles did. John tells us, they clearly did not think he was the Son of God, yet they stayed engaged with him because of what they were seeing happen in their lives. And that's the invitation to all of us. as we go through our journeys of faith, right? You know, whether you're going in Bonnie's class, you know, in kindergarten or first grade, or you're in your 80s or 90s, right? There's still a chance to grow. I think the greatest danger in our faith journeys is believing we have arrived, or believing there's nothing left that we can do. There's always more that you can do. I mean, Billy Graham was described when he was in his late 90s and he had very little mobility left. He spent his days praying for people. His family describes that he spent hours every day just praying for people. That no matter where you are, no matter what you have going on in your life, Jesus invites you into this new beginning and to recognize that the journey renews day after day. I mean, I think there's a real reason that God created the world so that the sun goes down and comes up every day. Because every day it's a chance to look at something new, to look at a new opportunity, maybe to put some things away so we can start fresh. God created us, created the universe so that we can refresh every day with a new beginning. And so my encouragement for each of us is to recognize that God is at work in your life right now. You can see it and follow it, or you can miss it. But you're only going to find it if you're looking for it. And we only begin to understand when we look back across our lives and see all the things that God is doing in our lives.